And it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Peter Singer, known to his readership as P.W. Singer, a 1997 graduate of Princeton, who has gone on. We've been talking about this. He's gone on to work at Brookings, and I have to admit I was a little surprised when I saw a 1997 graduate degree date and senior fellow at Brookings, because normally the time between those two events is a little bit longer. And Peter has the distinction of having been the youngest scholar ever named as senior fellow in the 90-year Brookings history. So that, I think, commends him already as an interesting speaker. He's best known for a book that came out a couple of years ago called Corporate Warriors, The Rise of the Privatized Military Industry. Probably the first book and I think the best book to come out on the whole phenomena of the private security firms. His newest book, and what he's going to be talking to us about today, is called Wired for War, The Robotics Revolution and Conflict in the 21st Century, or as it is billed for today, Everything You Were Afraid to Ask, Afraid to Ask, Afraid to Ask. Afraid to ask, for all of you who saw 2001 or any of the other number of movies that have come out on when the machines take over. His research has focused very broadly, as you can see from both one book on basically the reinvention of mercenaries, a very old concept, and a study of robots, a very new concept, on the issues of the future of war, as well as just U.S. current defense needs and the future of U.S. defense systems. But I think what is particularly interesting, there's a lot of people in Washington who look at the nuts and bolts of defense needs and look at the nuts and bolts of where we're going and what we're doing. But Peter, I think, brings a very particular question of the ethics of war and the ethics of defense needs and the ethics of how we go about this to the study of defense issues. He is very well known beyond those who have read his two books. He's a noted commentator, columnist, quoted often, Boston Globe, LA Times, New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Survival, Parameters, but he may also be the only person that I know who has had his book has been featured in a video game called Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriot, and short of being on Jon Stewart, which if you haven't been, I'm sure you will be soon, is probably the best thing I can say to recommend him. Last week? Okay, that's what I get for not watching John every night. So he has, forget the LA Times, Washington Post, and all those other things, Foreign Affairs, who cares? This is a guy who has done a video game and has been on Jon Stewart. Talking about the ethics of war, defense needs in the 21st century. Dr. Singer.
Thank you. I appreciate that kind welcome, and it's a real honor for me to be back here at Princeton. The thing as a graduate is that when you're a student here, you can't imagine that you'll be asked to come back and speak, let alone after this, apparently we're going to go eat at the Prospect House. Now, the flip side of that is when you're an alum, you really just want to go eat at the Haven. So it's a challenge here. So what I'd like to do is start out with a scene of war. There was little to warn of the danger ahead. Hidden alongside the road, the IED, the improvised explosive device, looked like any other piece of trash. By 2006, there were more than 2,500 of these roadside bombings every single month in Iraq, and they were the leading casualties among both American troops and Iraqi civilians. And the team that was hunting for this particular IED was called an EOD team, Explosive Ordnance Disposal, and they're the pointy end of the spear in the effort to stop roadside bombings. On a typical tour in Iraq, an EOD team will go out on 600 bomb calls. That is, they'll defuse about 2 bombs every single day. Now, the number that's probably the better indicator of how valuable these teams are to the war effort is the fact that the insurgents put a $50,000 bounty on the head of an EOD soldier. Unfortunately, this particular bomb call would not end well. By the time the soldier had advanced close enough to see the telltale wires coming out of the bomb, it exploded. Now, depending on how much explosive is in one of these IEDs, you have to be as far away as 50 yards to escape injury from the fragments coming at you. Sometimes the explosion can be so powerful that it can break your limbs, even if you're not hit by those fragments. This soldier, though, had been right on top of that bomb. And so when the dust cleared, the rest of his team advanced, and there was little left. And that night, the commander of that unit did their sad duty, and they wrote a condolence letter back to the United States. And they talked about how tough the loss had been on their team, about how the soldier had been the most valuable member, that they'd saved the others' lives on a number of occasions. And they apologized for their inability to bring that soldier home back to the United States. But then they talked up the silver lining that they took away from this incident. And this is what they wrote in the letter. Quote, "At least when a robot dies, you don't have to write a letter to its mother." That scene may sound like science fiction, but is actual battlefield reality. The soldier in that case was a 42-pound robot called a PackBot. The letter didn't go to some farmhouse in Iowa like is always, in the old war movies. It went to a company outside of Boston, Massachusetts that goes by the name iRobot. It's named after the fictional Isaac Asimov novel, the not-so-great Will Smith movie, and it's a real-world company. And in these fictions, robots start taking on daily chores and then move into making life and death decisions. And as you're going to see in the visuals that play for you, and what's interesting is somehow the machine decided to play it a little bit earlier here, but you're going to see pictures of these robots in action. Great, there we go. This is to demonstrate that they're all real. That is, nothing that you see flashing behind me is drawn by someone, is made up by someone. It's all actual photographs or videos of robots active in Iraq right now or Afghanistan right now or already in the prototype stage. Another way of putting it is, this is not science fiction. Nothing that you see is powered by Vulcan technology. This is not fantasy. Nothing that you see is powered by teenage wizard hormones. This is the real deal. All right, something big is going on in war today, and maybe even the overall history of humanity itself. The U.S. military went into Iraq with a handful of robotic drones in the air. We now have 7,000. We went into Iraq with 0 unmanned ground systems. We now have 12,000. And this is just a start. These are the Model T4s, the Wright Flyers compared to what's coming. And the technology industry term killer app or killer application doesn't just describe what iPods did to the music industry. They take on a whole new meaning when you're talking about armed robotics, because we're starting, as you see, to arm these things with everything from machine guns to rockets to missiles, you name it. That's where we're at right now. Peering forward, one Air Force 3-star general forecast that, quote, "It's not unreasonable to postulate future conflicts involving tens of thousands of robots." Now, these numbers matter in another way, because this won't be tens of thousands of today's robots. It'll be tens and thousands of the prototype robots you see here and the tomorrow's robots. Because one of the things you have in technology is Moore's Law. The idea that every 2 years, approximately, we're able to pack in more and more computing power such that our computers basically double in their power. It's the reason why, for example, if you gave someone a Hallmark greeting card for Valentine's that opened up and played music, that it had, that little greeting card, the amount of computing power that the entire Pentagon had back in 1964. Now, take Moore's Law moving forward, and it means that within 25 years, our technology, these robots, will be 1 billion times more powerful than today. And this is not, the amorphous, like Austin Powers, 1 billion. We literally mean take your computer, take the laptop you have in front of you, take your cell phone, and multiply its power times 1 billion. And so what that means is the kind of things that used to only be fodder for science fiction conventions like Comic-Con needs to be talked about in public policy, needs to be talked about in the halls of power, needs to be talked about in the Pentagon. A robot's revolution is at hand. Now, I need to be clear here. I'm not talking about a revolution with robots where you have to worry about, your Roomba attacking you in the middle of the night or something like that. Instead, when historians look back on this period, they're going to conclude that we're today at the start of a great revolution in warfare, a great revolution in social science, equivalent to, for example, the invention of the atomic bomb. Because every so often you have technologies that come around that rewrite the rules of the game. They force us to ask new questions about not only what's possible, but also what's proper. Now, on the civilian side, these are things like the printing press. But in war, it's things like the machine gun, gunpowder, the atomic bomb. Robotics is like that. It changes the how of war. But it's also different in a certain way. Because every previous revolution in war was, again, something that changed the how of war. Something that either had a bigger boom, shot faster, shot further. Robots certainly do that, but they also change the who of war. They change the warrior's experience. They change the warrior's very identity. Another way of putting it is that we are living through the end of humankind's 5,000-year-old monopoly on the fighting of war. And I thought that was a kind of big deal, so that's why I set out to write the book Wired for War. And what I did is basically went around using my Woody Woo Hone methodology and basically interviewed anyone and everyone who dealt in this field. Everything from robotic scientists to the science fiction authors who inspired them, to 19-year-old drone pilots flying drones over Pakistan but sitting in Nevada, to four-star generals who command them, the politicians that decide where they send these technologies, to the opposite side of it. What does the Iraqi insurgent think about our technologies? How about the person sitting at Human Rights Watch or International Red Cross? And so the book is really trying to bring together those stories. And the thing that's interesting to me is they're not only fascinating, exciting, even sometimes funny, also a little bit scary, but they also shine a light on some broader trends, some broader ripple effects that are taking place in our politics, our war fighting, our ethics, our law, you name it. And so what I'd like to do is flesh a little bit of these out for you. The first one is the fact that the future of war, even a robotic one, is not going to be just an American one. As you see flashing behind me here, the U.S. is certainly ahead in this military revolution, but we're not the only player. 43 other countries are working on military robotics right now. And a lesson we need to keep in mind is that there's no such thing as a permanent first mover advantage when it comes either to technology or to war. That is, quick show of hands, how many people right now are typing their notes on a Wang computer? How many people here play video games on your Atari? Technology, first movers don't always win out in the end. Same thing when it comes to war. The British and the French were the ones who invented and first used the tank. The Germans were the ones who figured out how to use it better. And so for us, with 43 other countries working on robotics that include not only countries like Britain, France, Israel, but also countries like China, Russia, Iran, we have to ponder where are we headed in this revolution, particularly given the state of our manufacturing inside the U.S. and the state of our education system when it comes to science and mathematics. Another way of putting this is, what does it mean to be sending out more and more soldiers whose hardware is made in China and whose software is written in India? But just as software has gone open source, so is warfare. That is, these technologies are not like an aircraft carrier. They're not like an atomic bomb. You don't need a huge industrial system to put them together. A lot of them use off-the-shelf technologies, commercial technologies. They're even do-it-yourself. For $1,000, you can build the equivalent of a Raven drone. A Raven drone is the one that you saw playing their video where the guy hand-tossed it out. Soldiers use it in Iraq and Afghanistan. For $1,000, you can build the equivalent of that. What that means is that we have a flattening when it comes to even these sophisticated technologies of war. That is, one group that features in the book is a set of college kids, actually from Swarthmore, who decided they wanted to do something about the genocide in Darfur. They fundraised for it. It actually turned out better than they expected. They got $500,000 in fundraising, And then they entered into negotiations with a private military company which offered to rent them drones. The entire negotiations took place out of their dorm room. You can't make this stuff up. There's a darker side of this, though, which is the cross between robotics and terrorism. For example, the war between Israel and Hezbollah last year was not only a war between a state and a non-state actor, which was something that academic theory, IR theory, said could never happen. Well, it did happen. But also, it was a war where both sides flew unmanned systems against each other. Hezbollah may not be a government, but it flew 4 different drones against Israel. You can go online right now and on a certain jihadi website remotely detonate an IED in Iraq while sitting at your home computer. And so the trends that this bodes for terrorism are 2 things. One is that it reinforces the power of individuals against states. The second is that it widens the game of terrorism, lets in new players. A way of thinking about this is that the future of terrorism may be a cross between Al-Qaeda 2.0 and the next generation version of the Unabomber. Because these systems, one, you don't have to be suicidal to have the effect of a suicide bomber. 2, you don't have to promise a robot that will be received by 72 virgins in heaven to convince it to blow itself up. And 3, they're going to anger at least a very small minority. We may well see the return of what they call neo-Ludditism. Basically, change can be frustrating for people. Change can be overwhelming for people. Debates over ethics and law can sometimes lead to violence. So, for instance, the debate over abortion for a very small minority got heated enough that they decided to turn to violence. They blew up abortion clinics. They shot at abortion doctors. Now, we have these technologies that really cut to the core of human identity and human philosophy and even human law. And so we shouldn't be surprised if a very small minority decides also to turn to violence. And that was actually a prediction of one of the people I met with for the book was Richard Clarke, who was the government official who famously warned about 9/11. He thinks this is the next wave of terrorism. Now, the ripple effects of this go out in other areas, such as the future of our own politics. One of the people that I met with for the book was a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Ronald Reagan, and this is what he had to say about these systems. Quote, "I like these systems because they save lives, but I also worry about more marketization of war, more shock and awe talk to defray discussion of the costs. People are more likely to support the use of force if they view it as costless." Now, for me, robots seem to take certain trends that are already active in our body politic and take them to their final logical ending point. We don't have a draft anymore. We don't declare wars anymore. Last time we did that was 1941. We don't buy war bonds anymore or pay higher taxes for war anymore. And now we have a trend that takes more and more of those that we would send into harm's way and outsources that to machines. And so what it means is that we may be taking those already lowering bars to war in our society and dropping them to the ground. But the future of war is also going to be a YouTube war. That is, these technologies don't merely remove the human from risk, they record everything that they see. So they don't just de-link the public from war, they reshape its relationship with war. There's several thousand video clips of combat footage from Iraq and Afghanistan online right now. You can go on YouTube and download clips of robotic combat footage. Now, that could arguably be a good thing. It could build connections between the home front and the war front that never existed before. The problem, though, we got to remember is this is not happening on Mars. This is not happening in the year 2150 or something like that. It's happening right now in our weird, strange world. And so for some people, the ability to download combat footage onto your email, onto your iPod, is turning war into a form of entertainment. Now, a typical example that I was sent was a email that had an attachment, a video clip to it, said, watch this, just like the same way you'd get a email with a video clip of some nerdy kid dancing in his basement or something like that. This clip, though, was of a Predator drone strike. Missile comes in, hits the target, explosion, bodies tossed in the air. It was set to music. It was set to the pop song, "I Just Want to Fly" by Sugar Ray. Soldiers have a name for this. They call it war porn. And what they mean is that we have the ability to watch more but experience less. And when you're watching it via these vectors, it's easy to forget that the violence is real. And it's easy to forget that not everyone is fighting from afar. The way I conceptualize it is it's almost like watching an NBA game on TV, where the basketball players are little tiny figures on the screen, versus watching that basketball game in person at the stadium, where you see what someone 7 foot tall really does look like, versus the experience of playing in that basketball game yourself and knowing what it's like to be dunked on by Kevin Garnett. They're very different. The problem, though, is that these clips aren't even watching the full game on TV. You're watching the highlight reel. You're watching the ESPN SportsCenter version of the game. And so all the context, all the strategy, all the training, everything that surrounds war itself, all just becomes slam dunks and smart bombs. Now, the irony in this is that the future of war may involve more and more machines, but its ripple effects are all driven by our human psychology, and war is still driven by our human failings. So there's a policy example of this that we're wrestling with right now. What are these systems' impact on the very real, very human war of ideas? That is, what is the message we think we are sending with these machines versus how is it being received in places like the Middle East? And so I went around, again, interviewing people about this. And one of the people I met with was a senior Bush administration official who talked about how, quote, "Our unmanning of war plays to our strength. The thing that scares people is our technology." But what about when you speak with those people? What about when you speak with people in Pakistan or Lebanon? And so, for example, this is what the leading news editor in Lebanon had to say. And he's saying this while there's actually a drone flying above him. And this is the message that he got, quote, "This is just another sign of the cold-hearted, cruel Israelis and Americans who are also cowards because they send out machines to fight us. They don't want to fight us like real men, but they're afraid to fight. So we just have to kill a few of their soldiers to defeat them." Disconnect between message sent and message received. Or another way of putting it is what one Pentagon analyst had to say, quote, "The optics of this look really freaking bad. It makes us look like the evil empire from Star Wars and the other side look like the Rebel Alliance." Now, the future of war is also featuring a new type of warrior, a cubicle warrior, that is someone who has a new experience of war itself that's reshaping the very meaning of going to war. So, for instance, my grandfather went to war in the Pacific in World War II. That meant he went to a place where there was such danger that he might never come back. The family might never see him again. Now compare that experience of going to war with how a Predator drone pilot described going to war against insurgents in Iraq while never leaving Nevada. Quote, "You're going to war for 12 hours. You're shooting weapons at targets, directing kills on enemy combatants. And then you get in the car and you drive home. And within 20 minutes, you're sitting at the dinner table talking to your kids about their homework." You can see the disconnect. You can see the challenges of that experience. And one of the things that's come out of it that we're just learning, for example, is that the pilots, these remote warriors, are actually experiencing higher levels of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, than the units that are physically deployed into Iraq and Afghanistan. But these trends of disconnection also lead to a new framing of the experience of war. This is what one young pilot described of taking out enemy troops from afar. Quote, "It's like a video game." Now, as anyone who's played the game Grand Theft Auto knows, there's things that we do in the video world, in the virtual world, that we might not do in the real world. And so much of what you're hearing here is that there's always two sides to technology. There's always two sides to a technological revolution. So, for instance, Moore's law may be operative with these systems, But so's Murphy's Law. Doesn't always work out the way we plan. Enemy has a vote. The fog of war still exists. Mistakes still happen. And sometimes these things, when they don't work with robots, are just described as one senior executive at a robot company put it to me. He said, these are just oops moments. Well, what are oops moments when we're talking about robots and war? Now, sometimes these oops moments are kind of funny, like when they tested out a machine gun armed robot, one of the ones you saw on the display there, and it actually went squirrely, started spinning in a circle, and then ended up pointing its machine gun at the reviewing stand of VIPs who were there to watch the demonstration. Fortunately, there was no bullets in the gun, so no one was hurt. Other times, these moments are tragic. For instance, last year in South Africa, an anti-aircraft cannon that was automated had a, quote, software glitch, and instead of firing up into the air during a training exercise, leveled and fired in a circle. It killed 9 soldiers. It was the scene from the movie RoboCop playing out in reality. Now, other times these things that come out of it are interesting legal dilemmas and how you deal with issues of accountability. So, for example, take the new phenomena of unmanned slaughter. That is, what happens when your machines accidentally kill the wrong person, such as the 3 times where we thought we got bin Laden with a Predator drone strike, and it turned out not to be the case, including one time where we got an Afghan civilian who was just unlucky enough to look a little bit like him. Now, that's where we're at right now. I'm not talking about systems with full autonomy, making their own decisions. But don't believe this isn't coming. In fact, during the research for the book, I came across 4 different Pentagon projects on various aspects of armed autonomous systems. And that takes the issues of accountability to a whole new level. What does it do to questions of things like war crimes? Now, on one hand, you could say it would make war crimes less likely, because robots are emotionless. Robots don't get upset when their buddy is killed. They don't commit crimes of rage or revenge. And that's how a lot of war crimes happen. But also, robots are emotionless. So to a robot, a 80-year-old grandmother in her wheelchair looks just the same as a T-80 tank. They're both just a series of zeros and ones. And so we have this question of how do we update our laws of war that are so old right now they qualify for Medicare to these 21st century technologies. And so in conclusion, I've been talking about what seems to be the future of war, but notice that all those pictures you saw were from the present of war. Notice that the examples I gave, other than that very last one, were all ones that had already occurred. So it puts the question before all of us, are we going to let the fact that this sounds and looks like science fiction keep us in denial that it's already battlefield reality? Or another way of putting it is, are we going to make the exact same mistake a previous generation did with another science fiction-like technology, atomic weapons? It was H.G. Wells who first came up with actually the concept, the very name atomic weapon. In fact, he came up with the concept of the chain reaction, which influenced the Manhattan Project scientists. And so are we going to make the same mistake another generation did, and looking at these things is something we don't talk about, we don't wrestle about the political and social and warfare implications of it until after Pandora's box is open? And the difference with that previous generation is we don't have the excuse they had. This isn't taking place in some secret desert lab hidden away. It's right in front of us. The pictures are here. The data is already here. Now, I could be wrong. And one scientist I interviewed at the Pentagon told me I was. He said there's no real legal or ethical or political problems he could contemplate with robots. That is, he added, quote, unless the machine kills the wrong people repeatedly, then it's just a product recall issue, end quote. Those are the quotes you love when you're doing research, because you're like, bingo. Now, there's a lot more to go into, but I'm going to end here. And I'm actually going to jump into science fiction. And the ending point is this. A couple years ago, the American Film Institute took a survey of gathering all the characters in Hollywood history. And it was to find out which were the top 100 heroes and top 100 villains in all of Hollywood history. Which characters in all of Hollywood represented the best of humanity and the worst of humanity. And there was only one character who made it onto both top 100 lists. It was the Terminator, a robot killing machine. And so it points to the duality of our machines. That is, they can be used both for good and evil. But for me, it also points to the duality of the people behind the machines. That is, our human creativity is what has distinguished us from all other species. It's what took our species to the stars. It's what created works of literature and art to express our love. And now we are creating something amazing, these incredible technologies that maybe one day both science and science fiction says could be a new species. We could be creating a new species in our image. But the reason that we're doing it is because of our inability to get beyond our need to destroy each other. And so the question is this: is it us or is it our machines that are wired for war? Thank you.
I've had the pleasure, since I've been at Princeton, to listen to an awful lot of speakers on an awful lot of subjects. And I don't think I have heard anything as well done and sobering as that presentation. And I well understand Brookings' decision. That was really quite something.
There's a certain professor I want you to go back and tell that to who gave me a B-.
I'll do that. I'll do that, I promise. I wasn't here then, so I know it wasn't me. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir. Yeah, if you can. Yeah, do come down to the mics. If it's on. Or scream.
Okay. Dr. Seaman, great to have you here. It's been said that an obsession with military technological advances that kickstarted a revolution in military affairs, that the idea that technology can change the rule of war is actually kind of a distraction from the kind of priorities that we need to fight certain kinds of war, namely counterinsurgency. I mean, a lot of people out there, including certain professors at the university, have made that claim, including Stephen Bennett, Stephen Naylor, Quincy Exam. And it's also been said by some that Rumsfeld and former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, in this code, were obsessed with the idea of making war extremely low risk and even costless through the use of technology. And that skewed our entire priorities, took us entirely off course, one of the many things that was doing that, in the two wars in which we now find ourselves engaged. So the question is, what is the likelihood in your view that the U.S. is going to either again or for the first time start taking this obsession with military advancements and technology, this robot war, into an entirely counterintuitive direction in a way that will take us off course again?
It's a great issue, and one of the things that we see when we move beyond academic theory in these lectures, when we see it out in the field, is that anyone who talks in absolutes is always wrong. And so these people who write on counterinsurgency, it's always a yes or no. It's always either technology is the silver bullet, it is the solution. That's the Rumsfeld, Zabrowski model, network-centric warfare, and I'll get to sort of why that's wrong. But then you have the other people that say, and I remember being told this by a professor at a different university when I was starting out on this, well, Iraq's the war that proved that technology didn't matter. And that's equally wrong. And so first on why these systems, the story of their connection to counterinsurgency, and this is something the book goes into a fair amount. The first is that for all the fact that Iraq proved we didn't want technology, it's actually the war that took robotics over the hump in terms of acceptance in the military. You know, if it proved we didn't need them, well, someone needs to tell that to the soldiers who basically have gone from using 0 to 7,000 drones in the air and 0 to 12,000 on the ground. And you go and meet with the various companies behind it, and they say, you know, look, the attitude of our customer, the Pentagon, went from, we don't want your stuff, to one company was told exactly, quote, make them as fast as you can. In the air, we're only meeting 5% of the soldiers' requests for Predator drone footage. The overall commander in Iraq described the Predator as the single most valuable system we have. Now, That's the first part. The second is these counterinsurgency thinkers who say technology doesn't matter are ignoring the actually fascinating back and forth in technology, in the fighting. That is, we are developing something new, the insurgents figure out a counter to it. We develop a counter to that, they develop another counter. So for example, we introduced robotics, they introduced low-tech traps for them. We got better beyond that, they introduced jammers for our communication. We introduced counter jammers. They actually captured a couple of our robots and turned them into mobile IEDs. They even have built, we've captured a very low-rent version of their own robot. One of them, it looked like a skateboard. It was designed to look like a skateboard, and U.S. soldiers averted a pretty big tragedy when they noticed the skateboard was going in the opposite direction as the wind, and the skateboard was packing explosives on it. So there's a back and forth in counterinsurgency that these all or none people ignore. The third part of it is, it's useful. I'm not arguing that counterinsurgency isn't something that involves social and cultural elements. That's what the book is about as well. But, you know, take the success of the surge. Some people say the surge is just having more troops. That's why we won, and if only they'd listened to me and sent more troops. Other people say, no, 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 no. The surge was the Sunni awakening. It was finally understanding the social, cultural dynamics and getting those tribal leaders to turn. The surge was also the efforts of Task Force Odin, which was a classified unit, and it's featured in the book, of we took human intelligence analysts and paired them up with drones and mapped out the bomb makers network. They basically went after the bomb makers network the way the FBI goes after the mob, figuring out who's who, so they wouldn't just find where the guy is planting the bomb, but they'd backtrack him to his safe house, and then backtrack that safe house to who brought the explosives to it, and then where did that truck come from, and they mapped out the entire network. That unit, using drones during the surge, killed 2,400 insurgents in 1 year. The surge isn't a victory if you don't have that unit. So that's my point, is it's this combination of all these factors there. The flip side is, you know, what I mentioned before, the all or none on saying technology is a silver bullet. Well, like I mentioned, the insurgents have figured out counters to it. The fog of war hasn't disappeared. And then the biggest argument that I have with sort of the Rumsfeld network-centric warfare is that they took exactly the wrong lessons of history. You can go back and read their stuff in the late 90s, and it's just hilarious, where they talk about how, now it reads in just awfulness, the U.S. can be just like Microsoft and permanently lock Apple out of the marketplace. That's a quote from them. It's this assumption, this arrogance that we'll always be ahead. They talk about, it's this idea of we'll always be ahead, and that you can, quote, lift the fog of war, and you'll be able to do more with less. The other part of this is no one 100 years from now is going to care that we went from using fax machines as our primary mode of communication in war and radio, to email. That's what they thought was a really big deal, and that was what was going to change everything. Whereas I think historians are going to care a little bit more about the fact that humans aren't fighting anymore. So it's a great question. Thank you.
Yes. Identify yourself as if you could.
My name is Rex Douglas. I'm a doctoral student in the politics department, and my question is, while it's obvious that there's a revolution going on in weapons that are air-based, it seems like there are still a lot of bottlenecks in ground-based systems that are kind of glossing over. Michael Hanlon wrote a book in 2000 talking about the revolution in military affairs, saying that while processing power is doubling every 2 years, everything else is improving at a much, much slower rate. So bottlenecks like power, for example, the cost of these systems, repairing these systems, how fragile they are in the field. I wish you could discuss some of those bottlenecks, which ones you think we're about to overcome, or maybe some time frames before we get to things like the Terminator supplementing troops in the field.
Sure. So Mike's office is like 2 doors down, so it's not like a new thing that he's arguing there to me. Notice the year you cited. Mike wrote the book in 1998, 99. It came out in 2000. Pretty much everything you saw there didn't exist when he wrote it. And he's writing that book as a counter to the network-centric folks. He's not even dealing with anything related to unmanned systems. In fact, he described in that book robotics as science fiction. It's not science fiction now, it is real. Now, that's not to argue that there aren't definitely bottlenecks in different areas of technology. And that's why I say again, remember, these things are the equivalent of the Model T Fords. Or Bill Gates, for example, when he looks at the industry, he says, you know what, robotics is roughly where computers were in 1980. They're somewhat bulky. They're mainly used by the military. There's a limited set of applications, but they're ready for a takeoff. And we are getting to the point where the interesting thing with computers, and it's the same thing that's happening with robotics, is they become so ubiquitous, we don't even call them computers anymore. We all have computers on us right now. We all probably have a cell phone. We all have computers in our kitchens. They're just called microwave ovens. It's the same thing with robotics. We're starting to see more and more of them in our wars and our workplace. The Lexus has an ability, the new Lexus parallel parks itself. It's not a robot car. It just has these applications. And people turn robots into this thing of either it's nothing or it's completely autonomous, brilliant, Terminator-like. No, there's a spectrum in that. Now, some of the bottlenecks, the biggest one I think is actually the power part of it. Not just getting enough power into that machine, but also quiet power, something the military wants. So you probably saw in the video there, I think it was in there, the Big Dog, which is basically looks like it's a horse without a head. The Big Dog, on one hand, scientists are amazed by it because it's basically able to walk on its own incredibly efficiently, better than a human could. One scientist described it as the Turing test, just not for AI. The flip side is the Big Dog is really loud right now. It sounds like a lawnmower, so if you're trying to sneak up on an enemy, a lawnmower coming at you is a pretty good indicator. I'm somewhat confident that over the next 20 years, we'll figure out how to make that system a little bit quieter. And the same way, it's not just me on this. There was a survey taken of both scientists and military officers who'd worked with robotics, and they asked them, at what year do you think we will have humanoid equivalent infantrymen? That is, a system equal to the powers of a human infantryman. The scientists, on average, came out to 2020. The military officer said, no, it's going to take a little bit longer. On average, they came out to 2025. Now, there's two things about that are notable. One is that that date's not that far off. That's before anyone here who owns property, we're not going to pay off our mortgages by then. But second, it's a survey. They could be exactly right. They could be completely wrong. It could happen before then. It could happen well after then. And for me, I actually think we're going to see more of a mixed robotic human teams. That's the plan of, for example, the Army's FCS brigades, where you'll have robots doing what robots do best, humans doing what they do best, and you're not going to see this kind of full-scale equivalent. And so, for example, you may say, oh, you could have a humanoid infantryman equivalent, but guess what? There's some things it could do better. It could fire more accurately. It's probably cheaper to train. You don't have to write a letter home to its mother if it dies. It can keep its eyes open 30 days. On the other hand, it doesn't have that mushy gray thing in our skulls, and so it has a hard time figuring out, for example, things like cultural relevance, telling a joke, knowing the difference naturally between an apple and a tomato. A 2-year-old knows that, a robot doesn't. And so that's the things that I see this playing out on. Yeah. I think if you're raising your hand, she's going to call you and then you come down. Yeah.
You, sir, after this gentleman, we'll take you, okay?
Miguel Centeno, I'm faculty in the school. I'm not sure there's a formal rule, Perot rule or something like that. The more you rely on these complex technological systems, the more fragile it is. Is there also a danger, purely from a U.S.-centric perspective, forget the ethical, just think as the bird colonel in the Pentagon word, purely about U.S. security, that over-reliance on this also creates a hole where somebody with enough computing power or knowing which telephone system to shut out, as it were, can destroy a large part of the defensive system or an offensive system. So GIs, and I say this with all due respect, I mean, GIs are They might be fragile physically, but you can depend on them to function autonomously. If you have a system that is so deeply interconnected and you have all these robots, and you can take out the mothership, a la Independence Day, doesn't the whole thing then fall apart and you're completely defenseless? Is this, or are they addressing this in the program?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's one of the things that I wrestle with in the book, and three quick things here. The first is they're probably the most militarily instructive research on that question is actually a short story by Arthur C. Clarke called Superiority. And in Superiority, there's a great quote in it where this soldier who's become a POW, trying to explain why his side lost the war, he says, "We lost the war because of the inferior science of our opponents." Let me repeat that again, the inferior science of our opponents. And we can all see like that today. You know, we've spent $6 billion against what one of the people I interviewed, a general, described this idiot technology of IEDs. The second thing, I do these lectures for lots of different kind of audiences. And a couple days ago I did it for a set of 80 U.S. military colonels who are being trained to become, they're on their way to becoming generals. And the vulnerability that's there is it's not if GPS is taken out, it's when GPS is taken out. If you're sitting in China, you know our absolute dependence on these things to get our missiles where we want them to go, for our robots to be able to find where they are, for me to get from Trenton to here. And it is an incredibly fragile network that's dependent on satellites that are easy to knock down. Now, we can make it a grid network and try and reinforce it, but you could also jam it. The communications between them is something that you can jam. And then related to this is again why it's a revolution. Wars involving robotics open the possibility of not just destroying your opponent, but persuading your opponent. That is, that soldier who, now I would argue actually 19-year-old soldiers don't operate autonomously just like robots don't. They're in a system. But the point is I can't hack into their head and reprogram them easily to do what I want. I can't jam them. I can't drop a virus into their head. I can do that to a machine. So we might have wars of persuasion happening. The final thing is, again, remember this is taking place in our weird, strange world. And so, you know, the most effective weapon against that sword system, that machine gun armed robot you saw there, is actually a 6-year-old with a can of spray paint. Because, yeah, exactly. You either have to be incredibly bloody-minded and shoot that 6-year-old, or that 6-year-old can walk up and spray paint all the sensors and you've got a blind robot. Now, I told that to this Pentagon audience and someone came back and said, well, we just loaded up with non-lethal weapons and tased that little 6-year-old. And great, you know, again, the back and forth of technology. But that's my point, is that there's no perfect solution. Even with something incredibly revolutionary, someone will always figure out something else. You know, the Death Star was the most powerful weapon ever invented in all of science fiction. Well, guess what? Some kid who grew up in the desert took it out.
Thank you for the talk. You titled it Wired for War, but you didn't seem to make a distinction between autonomous and simply remote-controlled robots. And in truth, most of the slides you showed were essentially remote-controlled devices, although I presume some of them have balanced servos and things like that that are nominally locally autonomous, but they weren't thinking autonomously. So in the context of Wired for War, can you expand on where you see that going? That is, autonomous systems that, let's say, have sniffers built in for smelling explosives of some type, and then you just turn them loose like a Roomba that instead of vacuuming your floor goes out and sniffs for some kind of chemistry of an explosive and then tries to just find it and set it off? It's in the case of an IED.
Yeah, it's a good question. Now, it's important to note here that autonomy isn't part of the definition of robots. It's a feature of the robot. So whether, and autonomy is also not something that's either a 1 or a 0, autonomous or not autonomous. It's a sliding scale. And we are getting further and further up that sliding scale. So for example, we've gone from systems that were completely teleoperated, human with a controller controlling every single thing that that system did, usually with a long wire coming to it. Then we got wireless, but then we got systems where the human's doing a couple of things. It's not driving the robot, it's robot go over there. The robot would figure out on its own and avoid the obstacles to get there, and figure out how to come back. Then it's moved to systems where the human isn't even piloting it, they are supervising what it's doing. The Global Hawk is an example. You can't describe the people operating the Global Hawk as operating it or even as pilots. The Global Hawk takes off on its own, flies its mission-following GPS grids, reacts to what it sees, and then flies back on its own and lands on its own. The CRAM, we were talking about this before, this counter-rocket artillery mortar system. It's called R2-D2. It looks like R2-D2 if he had a 6-barrel cannon. The human, it shoots down incoming rockets and missiles that the reaction time for humans is too short. You know, you've got an incoming artillery round, you basically can get to O, and that's about your reaction time. The robot can react quick enough to shoot it down. There is a human role in it, they turn it on and off, but that's about it. And again, keep going up this sliding scale of autonomy. And you know, you mentioned the Roomba, it's not a what if. The Roomba actually came out of Fetch. Fetch was a project that iRobot did for the Pentagon to develop a robot that could automatically sweep up airfields for cluster bomblets. And then two things, one, no one drops bombs on our airfields anymore, so there was no market for it. But two, they figured out they've got a technology that would be good for sucking up, you know, dust bunnies. And so there's this, you know, again, the autonomy game is definitely going. So yes, a good number of these systems, the human role in it is still there, or it's remote, but this is a sea change.
I just want to offer a brief follow-up that I don't think connected with on you. And that is that right now, most of the soldiers we have are young. And the reason they're young, and the reason they're soldiers, is because you can get them to do things that most older people won't do. When you go to an autonomous robot, it's then responding with its brain, if you will, to commands that can be programmed at a much higher intellectual level. It's not just a robot that's following orders in some simplistic sense. So you could get a situation where the nature of war truly changes, and in the context, again, of your title, Wired for War, I think that fundamentally changes the issue above and beyond just robots.
Yeah, I think, again, it takes it further. It doesn't, once you disconnect, then you get into the extent of how far you're disconnecting. But, you know, you saw the picture of the UCAV. That was a plane that it says historic first and it's dropping the bomb. The UCAV is a sense of its capabilities, you know, can take off and land on its own, fly on its own, but also it can react to enemy actions on its own, such as, for example, if a radar threat pops up that it's flying over and enemy missile site over there, it can vector in to hit that. Radar, enemy radar over here, it's smart enough to avoid it. It redoes its battle plan. Or, for example, you have battle management systems, which are basically AIs that plot out not only what your actions could be and write mission orders, but then develop what might the enemy's actions be and what are your potential responses to them. They're like an artificial aide-de-camp for the officers. And so, you know, again, this is sort of to get into a really detailed issue, but notice that, you know, it sounds like 10 years ago, we should be having this conversation at a science fiction convention. But it's something that people at JIFCOM, at the Joint Forces Command right now, are wrestling with. What is, for example, the impact of that battle management system they have right now? What's the impact of that on the laws of war? If the machine, if the AI gives you a certain set of options and says this is the optimal one, what if you, as the human officer, decide to do something different? If it works out good, we say, brilliant human officer, glad you went with your instincts. But what are the legal consequences if it goes bad? If you don't listen to your machine and you get friendly fire or civilian casualties? Are you legally culpable? This is an active legal question right now and no one knows. I mean, and if we are legally culpable, then we are saying under the law, we trust the machine more than we trust the human.
Hi, I'm Chris Baldessano. I'm a senior in the electrical engineering department and member of Princeton's Autonomous Vehicles Engineering Group. Thanks a lot for your talk, Dr. Singer. One question I had is, you mentioned yourself earlier about conflicts in the 21st century. And most of the conflict you talked about was between nations or between nations and insurgency groups. I'm curious if you think that this revolution is also going to happen in terms of conflict within a nation, in the sense of law enforcement or domestic surveillance. Do you think that we're going to see a similar kind of rewriting of the rules?
It's a great question. I'm going to. One of the fun things about writing a book that isn't defined as this is an academic book and we're doing it through University Press is you can actually sneak in a lot of things like political philosophy and people will read it. So I actually see Hobbes's social contract breaking down. This is the idea that a contract is built between the ruler, the sovereign, and their populace, and that if you didn't have it, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Now, this contract depends on two things. There's one that we talk a lot about, which is that in exchange for their loyalty, the sovereign, the government, the state gives protection. It delivers that protection that we need. Now, the second part of the contract that almost no one ever talks about is that sovereign, that government, has to respect your rights, has to give you that bubble for you to exist on your own. And you may be loyal to the king, but your home is your castle. Now, the challenge right now is that both of those are under threat. That is, states are finding it harder and harder to deliver on their promise of security. They've got all of these violent actors out there with more and more lethal technologies, and robotics continue that. One of the guys that I interviewed for the book was a DARPA scientist, same people that funded your guys' autonomous vehicle program. And he said, look, for $50,000, I could shut down Manhattan. And it's using autonomous vehicles, not using anything explosive. It was a pretty interesting plan. But the challenge for the state is it's finding it harder and harder. Now, the way it's responding is to get more and more surveillance, more and more invasive, to get more and more in our business. And this is the example of all the various data mining of our emails, all the various cameras that are going up. You can't go anywhere without a camera now watching you. And AI dropped into that as a camera that is making sense connecting dots. It's not the human connecting dots, the machine is. And it raises this challenge because the state's failing on both parts. And what do we make of that? What do we make of a world where you don't have 15 minutes of fame, you have 15 minutes of privacy? And do I give my loyalty anymore if they can't deliver? And that, I think, is a fundamentally interesting question, because it may not just be the end of humankind's 5,000-year-old monopoly of war that's part of the story. It's also the end of the state's 400-year-old monopoly over government and war. That is, the state rose because of a certain technology, gunpowder, back in the 1600s. That's it. Long story short, but basically the state made war, war made the state. The state was able to be the dominant force compared to kingdoms, dukedoms, city-states, you name it, because of the gunpowder revolution. Well, now we've got another new technology coming along, and should we be surprised if it maybe has some of these other ripple effects?
You actually just answered one of my questions, but basically what I was going to say is one of the things about turning towards wired technology in war is that the market becomes the bigger driver of military technology than the government does. And you had mentioned that there are several governments around the world that are moving in this direction. Well, the market is inherently global, so what does that say about the future of governments able to control the directions their militaries go? It's not inconceivable that, in the future, a rich state can, overpower a more powerful state, just in terms of their ability to buy technology or prevent suppliers of technology from servicing that state. Basically, the state loses all control. So, what's the future for the state to be able to hold on to that monopoly force? Is there a future for that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't see that monopoly working out for anyone anymore. I mean, there's very few what are our monopolies left in life, in business? Just when you have a monopoly, someone else is going to figure out how to crack it. And, the ripple effects of this are interesting. What does it mean for the U.S. if our business model, when it comes to not just regular business, but to war, is a bigger is better mentality? That is, we like big systems. That's the UCAV. That's the one I mentioned that flies itself and can react. It's the size of a bus. Bigger is better in terms of the price of what we pay for these systems. It costs right now $45 million. By the time it's deployed, $80 million. If you've got an $80 million system, you may not have a person inside of it, but are you going to treat it as disposable? Are you going to be the Navy captain that just throws away an $80 million system? We have a bigger is better mentality when it comes to the timeline. It takes us not merely years, but decades to develop a new system. The F-22 that just entered military service, that was first started in 1979. So a question here is bigger is better with these robots in war? What if smaller is better? What if instead of a small number of high-quality, expensive systems, you want to have the Chinese business model? There's a lot of cheap, disposable ones that maybe aren't all that good, but if you've got 30 of them, great, you can shoot down the first 6, but too bad. What if the technology cycle is so quick? And so that's a challenge for us in the U.S. Another question that connects to this in a different way is, and it connects back to the previous question, what's the ethics of this and how are they globalized? That is, when people talk about robot ethics, they always jump to Asimov's 3 laws. Well, the first is Asimov's laws. They're written in English. You can't program English. The second is Asimov's laws, are fictional. Every story, it's always someone, the laws break down or they go around them. The third problem with it is Asimov's laws are exactly opposite to the way we're using these systems. One of the robots shall not harm human. Well, if you're arming the robot with a machine gun, that's kind of the point of it. The robot's supposed to take instruction from any human. Well, do I want a robot that just when it's about to shoot bin Laden, he says, robot, stop, and then it does stop? So it should be able to take instruction from anybody. But then the other part of this is that the ethical question we really should be looking at is the people behind the robots. And so there's questions on a global level we need to figure out, like, for example, not only what should we build, but what features should they have? And you see a lot of different international attitudes about it. For example, in the U.S., we're actually kind of freaked out by armed robots. It comes out of our science fiction, because the robots are always, this slave that works for us that then gets smart enough that it revolts. Well, in Asian science fiction, the robot is always the good guy. There's no such consternation about robots. And so one of the things the book talks about is a commercial in Korea for a machine gun armed robot. And the commercial is on TV and set to music. It's set to the theme song from Pirates of the Caribbean. It's sort of this rousing, aren't we excited to have machine gun robots? Or another, so that question of what should they feature, but also who should have them? Which government should be allowed to have these systems or not? Maybe I'm okay with South Korea having machine gun armed robots. Am I okay with Iran having them? How about, should it be limited, prior question, to just the state? Homeland Security is flying Predator drones. What do I think about that? What do I think about the fact that the LA Police Department is buying drones to fly over a high crime neighborhood? It makes logical sense, but it gets kind of creepy. How about me? Should I be allowed to own a machine gun armed robot? I mean, are they going to take that armed robot out of my, cold dead hand? That's my Second Amendment right? I don't know, but those are the kind of ethical and a different way of looking in the U.S. or globally. All those things are sort of fascinating things to me that, we could talk about them in science fiction conventions, but they have a very real political resonance right now. But I guarantee you, you're probably not talking about it in a public policy school right now.
Bill, I think you're going to have a last question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mind-blowing. There's a failure point, universal failure point in all of this. EMP which will blow the communications links and the systems that use the links. And there's the link interference, whatever kind of jamming you mentioned a little bit. My question is, are the people that are working on all of this taking EMP and other forms of jamming into account?
So this guy is definitely a lover of the Matrix movies, because EMP was the only system that worked against the evil robots in the Matrix. And it's a very real technology. It's not a new technology. You know, we first discovered it in the late 1950s, where it's basically the idea that you get this electromagnetic pulse that literally fries circuit boards. It literally, in some cases, will catch them on fire. Now, EMP, though, great for going against civilian technology. Military technology can be shielded against it. And there is a fair amount of work on that. Now, the flip side is, again, this is one of the things that plays out. It's in our strange world. So you have massive pressure on the Pentagon to lower its costs, to buy off-the-shelf technology. So while military circuitry used to all be guarded against EMP, now some of it is not guarded against EMP because it's cheaper and easier to buy these chips from anywhere. It's also another reason why the hacking on them is going to be a lot easier, because we get a lot of these chips from China, and they think there's Trojan horses built into them and things like that. So back and forth with EMP. Same thing, you mentioned communications. And that's actually, you know, again, communications can be jammed. That's what actually leads you to the prior question about autonomy, because the military knows the communications can be jammed. And it went from being, they actually, when they originally bought the PackBot from iRobot, it had more autonomy than they wanted, and so they asked the company to strip out some of the autonomy. The robot, for example, could go out on a mission, and then if the communications broke, find its way back. And the military said, we don't like that. Now, the new versions, they like that, because they realize the enemy is starting to jam our systems, and so they want more and more autonomy in them. Or, for example, they say, well, you don't get any personnel savings if you just have one guy controlling one robot, so you want one guy controlling 5 robots. Well, that means they've got to be a little bit more autonomous. The ability to shoot a robot you shoot at a robot, the radar system. It's a counter-sniper system. It uses acoustics to, if a sniper shot at us, it would immediately put a laser beam on their head. Now, that system, they say, well, it shouldn't fire. We don't have that system fire at the guy. But then you get to the sense of, well, it's war. If the human reaction time is too slow, it may put the laser beam on his head, but then he moves. So why don't we give it the autonomy to, it doesn't fire first, but it can fire back. And so what I'm getting at is you see all of these slippery slopes where people say, no, we'll never ever give these systems autonomy, but then for reasons of war, for reasons of efficiency, because of things the enemy might do or will do, we go down that pathway of giving them more and more autonomy. So is that I think we're at the witching hour here.
Yes.
I appreciate all of you coming out. It's a real big honor for me. Thank you very much.